it's hard to just not rush to baby, but I think it's good to, even if it's just for a moment, to pause and say, how can I get the best information possible? And how can I regulate my nervous system, because I need to be able to manage this for the long haul.
Welcome to the Surrogacy Scoop, a podcast brought to you by Patriot Conceptions, where we demystify the world of surrogacy from the clinical, family, and surrogate perspective. Today, I'm joined by Lisa Schuman, licensed therapist and founding director of the Center for Family Building. Lisa is an expert in family building and has helped people around the world build their families. Lisa is also a fellow podcaster as host of the Building Your Family podcast. Welcome to the show, Lisa.
Thank you so much for having me, CJ.
I'm so excited to jump in today, but before we get too far, tell us a little bit about yourself and maybe how you got involved in this industry.
So I got involved in this industry decades ago. I don't know if I even want to say how many years, but a long time ago, because I had fertility treatment myself. And I realized that there were so many difficulties that people weren't talking about. And at the time, had been a therapist working with people who were going through various issues in their life. And my doctor thought that it would be helpful for his patients if I could see them professionally. So when I was finished with my family building journey, I went to the American Society for Reproductive Medicine and got all the training I possibly could get. And for the next several decades, continued to participate in industry-supported events and learn as much as I can. And since then, I've worked in-house in several fertility clinics. So I've really seen it from the inside out. And through my experience, both personal and with the thousands of people that I've seen, I have seen time and time again that there's so many issues that people don't really understand. And so now, as I'm older and as I'm entering this next decade of my life, I really want to help as many people as possible. And I feel like there's a lot of misinformation out there. And I don't want people to rely on Dr. Google for everything. I think it's really important to have information from people who have a lot of experience and who are seasoned professionals. So I wrote a book about this called The Complete Guide to Building Your Family, The Complete Guide to Donor Conception. And I also now am beginning a membership for people who want to join at a lower cost, but also want to have all the education and support that they need, because I really want to get good help out there in the world.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that comprehensive overview. And I think, maybe a good place to start here today is you do have so much experience kind of in a lot of different aspects of this field. How do you think things have changed over the whole time that you've been both as somebody who went through family planning and then also now as a professional in that field?
Mm. Well, when I was working, or before I was working in fertility treatment, I tried surrogacy myself. And it was such a nightmare to do that in this area in New York. And since then, fast forward more than 20 years later, I was the only therapist asked to testify before the State Senate Judiciary Committee to legalize surrogacy in New York, which was such an honor. But it took that long for New York to make compensated surrogacy legal. And so everything has really changed in my hometown of New York. Things are so different. And now we saw just recently that Michigan made surrogacy legal. And so now we have a much more even playing field, and people don't have to really worry about all of the difficulties that typically would concern you when you have to kind of go out of state. You don't know where to go. That as long as you're following not always the legal background, but the guidelines set forth by the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, you're really in a safe space. And most clinics worth their salt will do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's such a dynamic industry. Things continue to change day to day. A couple weeks ago, we were recording a podcast as I think it was the Supreme Court was hearing a case related to surrogacy. So it's something that it changes and evolves constantly. And so it makes your role as professionals in this field really dynamic and just always changing.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely.
So maybe kind of going back to what you said in your introduction, you talked a little bit about not wanting to rely on Dr. Google and wanting to make education accessible. Maybe what are some common misconceptions about family building that you encounter, and then how do you go about addressing them?
Hmm. So there's so many. I think we need 20 podcasts for me to share everything I know, but certainly I would say if people are interested in a deeper dive, you can take a look at my book. It's available on Amazon or Barnes& and Noble or anywhere books are sold, and I have an audiobook, or join our membership program. But I would say that with the surrogacy industry, which is very specific, it still, I think, needs to grow a little bit more because agencies are still not regulated. And so it can be a little confusing for patients to know, how do I pick a good surrogacy agency, for example? And that's a very complicated situation because with fertility treatment, you can go to the CDC website or the website for the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, and you can look for your doctor's statistics and then see how good is this doctor compared to somebody else or some other clinic, right? Because the lab is also very important. And so you can see that there is no such thing in surrogacy. You can't compare agencies. So people very often will look in an agency that their friend used or that their doctor recommended or that has a nice website. And although those are all nice things, they definitely do not give you all the information you need. So I think we need to kind of think about how we make other important decisions, like if we had to have significant surgery in our life, or we wanted to find the best school for our child. We would do our homework and make sure that these places had good reputations, that these places consistently could manage difficulties, that these situations or institutions or people had a ton of experience. Those are all important elements in the process. And yet people don't really ask those questions. If you have someone who has this beautiful website and they have just started their surrogacy agency yesterday and they've had no experience or maybe some very negative experiences because of course now the laws are very different in every state, so you have to be able to be cognizant of that. What do you do if your surrogate's in a state that's not friendly to, let's say, termination or medical testing issues? What do you do? How do you handle these difficult situations? And if somebody's been around for a long time, you know that they've had lots of these experiences, just as your surgeon would, right? If you chose a surgeon who, let's say, is very involved in professional organizations and has done, tons of surgeries like the ones you're having, then you have a good sense that this person knows what they're doing, right? But if they're new, just out of medical school, and maybe they've had one surgery in their career and they're not very recognized or involved in these professional organizations, no matter how nice their website is, you wouldn't want to go with that surgeon, right? So I think we have to think just as carefully about our surrogacy agencies and think about, is this group going to help me through the tough times if I have them? Does this group know what they're doing in terms of recruiting surrogates? Does this group have a good reputation, not just with my cousin or my neighbor, but with many people over time? So I think those things are really important to look at, and it's very difficult to kind of think about that in the moment when you're kind of desperate to move forward.
Hmm. That's that's incredible insight. Honestly, $1 million insight. I feel like we just got on the podcast today because that's just exactly it. There's, how much homework or how much rule checking can you do before, you know, do you just go off your gut intuition? Do you go off what your family and friends recommend you? There's so many questions that pop up alongside this. And that's where the early education, as much education as you can get before you start this process, is just so valuable and so important. Um, we will definitely include links to your book and your membership in the show notes, but I want to dive in a little bit deeper into your book. You mentioned it now. What was kind of the motivation for writing your book? And then obviously we want everyone to read the book, so let's not give away too much, but what is like a little teaser maybe of some particularly valuable takeaways that you think you created there?
So, again, I think it's really important for people to really think about their decisions. But I think people need two things. They need the right information and they need to be able to regulate their nervous system, because when we're
Mhm.
anxious, we can't absorb information, right? So if the doctor says, you know, I'm sorry to tell you, but you really need to use a gestational carrier, or let's say you're a same-sex couple and you're having trouble finding a gestational carrier, or let's say you're a single person with no supports and you think like, oh, well, I've just got to find the most warm and loving agency. You're not in a good place to make a decision because you're doing it with a lot of anxiety, right? And so what we were just talking about is thinking through some of these things. The same is true for donor conception, where people will very often look for a donor who maybe they think is attractive or smart, or maybe plays the violin because their family's musical, or maybe has the same ethnic or cultural background. And those are all lovely things. But unfortunately, those are things over which we have no control, right? Even if we have genetically related children, we don't know what they're going to look like. We don't know if they're going to have the same traits as us or not. So we really need to think about all of these examples. We all have people in our lives who we've seen don't look like their brother or sister, or don't have the same personality type, or don't have the same musical talent, or whatever. So since we can't control that, why not look for the things we have some control over first? And then we can also think about these other things that maybe are pleasurable to us, but maybe are things that are not within our control. And I think there's some significant things to look for first, like medical history. People say, well, my donor's healthy. Well, of course, your donor's healthy. They're 25 years old and young, but health does change over time. So we need to kind of think about that and how we look at that. We have to think about genetics, not just in terms of what your genetic counselor will give you, but other ways to think about the genetic complementary system between you or the person who's genetically related and the donor. I think we need to kind of think about other things that are tough to think about, like levels of openness and how we can make peace with that or deal with that for our own family. There's so many other issues that we do have some control over that could be really, really important to our child in the future that very often get thrown to the wayside because we're kind of eager to feel comfortable with our donor. And that's understandable. You're choosing a donor, and this is the genetic material you're choosing for your future child, which feels so incongruent to everything that we know, right? We want to be able to feel close to our child. We want to feel connected to our child. And yet we're using the genetics from this person who feels like a stranger. Of course, it's going to feel uncomfortable. And of course, we're going to look for what makes us comfortable. But I think it's good to step back and say, okay, well, what are the things that will really make a difference in the long run? And that is, genetics, that is health, that is giving your child access to their genetic information later, and all sorts of other things before I want that person to have my long line of family freckles or whatever. So I think that those things are really important. So that's one of the things that we talk about in the book. And, with regard to surrogacy, it's similar. As I said, I think it's really important to step back and say, yes, I have to go through this process. And yes, it's going to be a bit of a roller coaster, but I need to step back and think about what are the things I have some control over first, and what are the things that I can really implement into my life that will have lasting effects down the road. And so with the surrogacy, some of those things are really thinking through your relationship with your surrogate and what that's going to look like. Thinking through issues like medical testing and termination issues, thinking through your delivery plans, thinking through all of these things that are going to be really important. But if you can take it a step beyond what your agency is giving you or what your surrogate's giving you and really think through these things, then you can bring more benefit to that relationship. You can bring more benefits to that experience because you're really kind of taking charge of this. And I think that that's ultimately where people are happiest, right? When they feel like they have more control over a situation that feels very out of control.
Mhm. 100%. And the insight that you have from the mental health perspective, I think is completely invaluable to this, because I think it's a piece that people maybe don't consider even deep into the surrogacy journey is
Mhm.
just how much that emotional piece plays into it. Maybe could you talk a little bit about from your work as a therapist, what are some of those common themes that arise when you are working in this planning space?
So, with regard to the mental health aspect, I think that, one of the important decisions to make is to really consider having an objective person do the psychological screening on both your donor and your surrogate. Because if you just rely on somebody who is, let's say, a friend of somebody at the agency, they're going to be incentivized maybe to pass this person. And maybe there's somebody that can be passed, but maybe they're not. And I've seen many, many reports come across my desk of surrogates and donors who should not pass screening. And that's super important because, from the donor's point of view, this is the genetics for your future child. And for the gestational carrier, this person's carrying your child. You need to make sure that they, to the extent that you can, that this person is emotionally stable, that they're going into this situation for the right reasons, that they want to be honest and transparent with you, that they're not in financial duress and just doing this for the money, that there's no conflicting feelings between them and their family members about doing this. There's all sorts of things that you really want to look at. And so the way that we do that is through a psychological screening and interview. And the second part is through a test called the PAI. One of the people who helped to create this test is one of the guests on my podcast. And we talk about how important this is, even when you have a known donor or a known surrogate, because you want to make sure that not only are they psychologically healthy, but if they are ambivalent and it's right under the surface and we can't see it, then we need to be able to bring that to light, because you don't want that person to move forward with you if they really don't want to do this. And I've had many people back out at the last minute. And as upsetting as that is, it's better because you don't want them to feel those conflicting feelings when they're 6 months pregnant or after they've donated their eggs. You want to make sure that you uncover this early and have your group meeting with your surrogate and with your donor and with the intended parents, and talk about some of these things. And sometimes you can hash it out in the meeting, but sometimes it doesn't work out. And that's better because you want to make sure this is the right person for you. And in the PAI, we have a screening for psychopathology, but there's also a screening for deception. So if the donor or the surrogate is trying to be somebody they're not, or trying to hide aspects of themselves they don't want us to see, we would see that in the test. And if the number's elevated, we would have concern about that person.
Wow, thank you again so much for sharing that. I think the episode from your podcast with the creator of the PAI believe is what you
He
said.
was- yeah, he
Yeah,
helped create it. He wasn't the main creator, but he assisted in the creation of it.
very cool. We'll definitely include that episode in the show notes as well. I just you have so much insight and you're giving us so many like really valuable nuggets here. So thank you for sharing all of that.
You're
Maybe
welcome.
let's kind of jump over a little bit. You again mentioned it in your intro that you testified before the State Senate Judiciary Committee on legalized compensated surgery in New York. I think I said all of that correctly.
Mhm.
But could you maybe share a little bit about your experience, about that whole journey and your testimony itself?
Sure. So my practice was always based in New York. But for almost a decade, I worked in Connecticut, and I worked for the largest clinic or the largest surrogacy clinic. So it's the clinic that has the most amount of surrogacy cases in
Mm.
the state. And so we saw so many, excuse me, we saw so many surrogacy cases. And so after all of my experience and seeing a lot of patients who I saw were struggling and trying to help them through their struggles, I was asked, now that New York was, again, it had to try several times, the state had continued to petition to have this case heard. And I think it may have been the fifth attempt to legalize surrogacy, and they finally were able to pass the bill. So what we were really trying to do was try to help everyone involved understand, all the legislators, and understand how important surrogacy was. And we really had a lot of opposition because there was a lot of discussion about surrogacy being only for, let's say, very wealthy gay men, or surrogacy was really not necessary because it would be easy to adopt, which also is not true. And then we also had, believe it or not, which really shocked me, a lot of opposition from liberal women's rights groups. And so even Gloria Steinem was opposed to it. And I think that they misunderstood what surrogacy was about. They saw surrogacy as being something like it is in, let's say, India or some other country where women sometimes aren't treated well or sometimes get taken advantage of. And so there was this belief that surrogacy was a bad thing and would create this whole industry where people would be taken advantage of. Of course, that's not true in the US, and we have guidelines that fortunately most clinics will follow. And we do have the FDA, which really helps ensure that this is a healthy process. So we have all of these guardrails in place that other countries don't have. And yet there was this constant discussion about this fear that things were going to be a problem. And so fortunately, we were able to have several people testify who were women who were cancer survivors, people who've had terrible traumatic pregnancies that ended up in situations where they may have lost their uterus or their ability to carry for some reason, and this was their only chance. So we had a lot of evidence that showed the legislators that this was really important for everyone, and yet it was still quite a struggle. And so in the end, we were able to support a imperfect but substantial piece of legislation that finally passed. And fortunately, even though it's imperfect, the fertility clinics are really following the ASRM guidelines, which is really important, even more than the legal guidelines, because it gives you that added layer of protection that everybody really needs.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that is so interesting, and it is
Mhm.
so the legal process and the legality behind surrogacy across the country. We haven't had a lawyer yet on the podcast, but that's definitely on my bucket list. It introduces so many challenges that, people maybe inside the industry couldn't have predicted. Like, the piece that you said about the women's movement being opposed to it because of some misconceptions from other countries, I really never could have anticipated that being a problem that you would run
Yeah,
into.
yeah, it was shocking. It shocked me as well.
Mhm. And I think that really too just highlights the importance of education, highlights why there needs to be accessible resources for people just to learn about surrogacy and what the whole deal really is.
Hmm. Absolutely. I agree
Yeah.
with you 100%.
We're on the same page.
Mhm.
At the tail end there, you mentioned a little bit about the importance of the legal system and legal protection. Could you maybe talk a little bit about what that importance really looks like for people, either intended parents or potential gestational carriers, and the importance of that legal representation?
Okay. So I think the legal protections are one thing, but at least in New York, they don't do everything that we need. We
Mm.
have, for example, in New York, there's no rule that a surrogate has to have had a previous pregnancy and delivery. So we really feel, we being people in the industry, really feel that that is an essential requirement. These women who are helping, of course, are doing this out of the goodness of their own heart, but we want to make sure that we also have a baby at the end of this, right? And so the intended parents need to understand that they're putting a lot of time and money and their heart and soul into this. And so we want to know that that person who's going to be carrying the baby can carry a pregnancy to term, have a healthy pregnancy, deliver the baby, and we also don't want to see any negative implications for her going through pregnancy. We don't want to see, significant postpartum depression or anxiety or anything like that that's going to give us an indication that this is going to be harmful for her in any way. And so that's just one example of something that's not in the New York law, but is, let's say, in Connecticut and New Jersey and some other laws. But it is available through the American Society for Reproductive Medicine. So what I urge people to do is to follow the guidelines from the American Society for Reproductive Medicine.
Mm.
Make sure that their clinic is following those guidelines. Make sure their agency understands those guidelines, because that's really the gold standard. That's where you're going to have guidelines that are really going to protect everyone involved, protect the patients, protect the surrogate, and then also have an eye on, most importantly, the future child. And that's so significant.
Hmm. Yeah, the differences between state jurisdictions and maybe the lack of universal statewide or nationwide rules around surrogacy, I imagine, is something that comes up pretty frequently just across this industry in general, but especially in your line of work. What are some maybe things that individuals should be aware of when entering agreements across various places around the country, different jurisdictions?
Yeah, so I really think, again, that people who are going through this, the patients, should look at, and they can go to ASRM.org and go to the American Society for Reproductive Medicine's website and make sure that their doctor and their agency and everybody is on board with these basic guidelines that we all really feel strongly about. There's been a lot of discussion, they've been revised many times, and a lot of minds who are much smarter than mine get involved in the ethic boards, and the mental health people and the legal people and the medical people all put their 2 cents in, and we really make sure that they're going to give us the best document possible. And so it's really worthwhile following that. And I think that everyone involved in this industry should really try to do that. So I think that's number one. And then I also think, as I said before, I think it's really important to make sure that your agency can handle all of the differences between different states, right? And particularly now, because we are in a world where reproductive rights are different in every state. And so if you, let's say, are someone who wants to reserve the right to terminate if there's some medical difficulty, and if your surrogate is in Florida or Texas or someplace, Louisiana, where there could potentially be an issue, if she, let's say, had a tubal pregnancy or there's some other issue, we even have recently a physician posted online that there, in her state, that there was a lot of difficulty because there is a medication that's used to help women very often release the pregnancy if they have a problematic pregnancy, let's say a tubal pregnancy, and it does cause contractions. And so for many hospitals, they use this medication to also help with hemorrhaging.
Mm.
And since some of these laws have been changed, that medication has been taken out of the basket of medications that can help with hemorrhaging. And so if you have a surrogate who's got a ectopic pregnancy, for example, and she goes to one of these hospitals, she may not be able to save her life, right? So we really need to make sure that your agency can handle these situations and understands how to navigate. But we also want to make sure that your agency is screening as I mentioned earlier, the surrogate properly, and does want to help the intended parents have the intended parent meeting, have the gestational carrier screening, and have the group meeting. And even though people don't want extra costs and spend extra time on this, it's really helpful. And a little bit of work ahead of time can save so much aggravation down the line. So those are things are really important.
Hmm. Yeah, thank you for highlighting all of that as well. We'll definitely include a link to the ASRM website, or the American Society of Reproductive Medicine, because those insights that you just shared and all of those like individual state by state cases, it really does have a impact that maybe people can't anticipate, or wouldn't know if there wasn't this importance of education that we're sharing today going forward. And I think too, throughout all of the answers and all the things we've talked about today, education availability, or maybe like the availability of the knowledge, really seems to be a core philosophy of your practice and your work. And that's really coming through today. So thank you for sharing that. As we kind of maybe go towards the tail end of the podcast today, you mentioned your membership program earlier. I'm personally a little interested in that. So would you mind sharing with your audience kind of what that is, what that entails, and where they can find out more?
Yeah, sure. Be happy to. So I had two surrogacy episodes on my podcast, so people can find that on YouTube or anywhere they listen to podcasts if they want more specific information about surrogacy. But the membership was created because I really do feel that people who go through family building journeys in unconventional ways, right? They're not getting pregnant at home for whatever reason, for medical reasons, or because they're a single parent or a queer parent. They really need to think about two things. One is regulating their nervous system, and two is getting the right information. And it's so confusing, all the information out there. So I've taken all of my video programs, all of my downloads, everything that I sell on my website, and put it into this membership for free. So people can access a whole library of information. There's content there on donor conception, on surrogacy, on every topic. We also have weekly calls so people can come in and ask their questions, meet with experts every week. We have guided meditations to help people feel calmer and be able to manage their nervous system better and have better relationships, but also absorb the information better. And we also have communities for every group, for people going through surrogacy, people going through donor conception, people going through fertility treatment. And so that way they can get in there and talk to other people who are going through similar difficulties and get support and get help. And we're going to be monitoring these boards too. So we have an opportunity to have exchanges with these people. And it's all very inexpensive. It's $84 for 3 months. So it's less than $1 a day in the end. And it'll be a very nice resource for anyone who's interested in family building. And we're opening it up in November. So I'm very excited about that.
Awesome. Well, thank you
Yeah.
so much for sharing. And we will definitely include information about how our audience can get involved with that in the show notes. Really just having community and having people that you can go to and talk to and answer your questions. Because again, this isn't something that most people are doing day to day. Most people don't interact with surrogacy in their everyday lives, or even just, as you said, unconventional family planning. So those kind of communities and resources, I think, are just completely invaluable.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, that's my aim. I really want to help people have a better path to parenthood and a better parenting experience. We also have a section for people who are parents because this doesn't end, right? People need to understand how to talk to their donor conceived child, how to talk to their child about surrogacy and how they came into the world, how to deal with family and friends, how to deal with their communities, schools, soccer coach, all of
Mhm.
those things. And so we have a whole parenting section too. So people can continue on their way to get lots of resources and support and education about all of these stages. We also offer a developmental stages program so people can see over different developmental stages of their child's life what might be important to them if they're donor conceived. So we offer a lot of content in there, and people can find it on my website at familybuilding.net. And I think they'll be very happy to see it. There's a lot there.
Awesome. Well, I am so excited to check it out. I hope our audience is as well. As we maybe wrap up here today, is there any other, final piece, words of wisdom that you can share with our audience today, of mostly people who are interested or just trying to learn more about surrogacy in general?
Yes. Well, I think that everyone needs to appreciate they're doing the best they can. I really believe that everybody does the best they can with the information they have. And this is a tough situation. To need a surrogate, to pay for a surrogate, to find an agency, all of it is hard, no matter whether you're a heterosexual couple and have a history of loss and pain. if you're a queer couple and you feel like I've always known I'm going to do this, so it's not as stressful, but I still have to go through learning, my 8th grade biology again, and I've got to go through understanding my relationship with my surrogate and these crucial issues. So I really appreciate that it's really a struggle for everyone who goes through this, and I want to support people and let them know that, we're here for them and there's lots of good information out there. It's hard to just not rush to baby, but I think it's good to, even if it's just for a moment, to pause and say, how can I get the best information possible? And how can I regulate my nervous system because I need to be able to manage this for the long.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing and thank you so much for your time today. Literally $1,000,000 a minute. So I'm so thankful that we got to have this conversation today. Plug your website, plug your book, anything else, any other social media that people can find you at?
Yeah, so I'm on at Instagram at the Center for Family Building and at Family Build on TikTok and LinkedIn and all of those platforms. You can find me or you can just Google me and you'll find all of it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Lisa. Incredible conversation we had, and maybe we can do a follow-up in the future.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you, CJ. I really appreciate your time too.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Surrogacy Scoop, and I hope you found value in this meaningful conversation. For all resources mentioned in the episode, or to connect with Patriot Conceptions online, visit the description. Don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast hosting platform, and share this episode with those in your life who may be interested in getting involved.